Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining. I saw a lot of really interesting questions come through, but I've also prepared quite a bit of content to share. I don't want to be stuck presenting slides, so please participate. Chris is going to help me moderate and look at the questions. And so if you have any questions as I speak, or if you want me to speed up or slow down at various places, just yell. So as Chris mentioned, we've known each other for 20 years, way longer than a lot of, like half my life, essentially. Chris and I have known each other. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So I'm currently the head of diversity and inclusion for McKinsey across Asia, but I'm also a coach and facilitator for a lot of our external client-facing programs on leadership and organizational development. So this is a really interesting topic for me to share with you today. And hopefully with a bit of interaction, we can all learn from each other as well, because I'm just providing some frameworks, but you guys have experience and stories that I'm sure will be able to enhance this conversation. So let me just start by sharing my presentation. I have a mentee poll that I've set up. So if you guys have a device or a new tab that you can use, and go to mentee.com and enter the code that's on the front page, 762829. And I'm just going to flip over there and ask you two questions. The first question I'm curious about is, how's your productivity and performance now versus pre-COVID? And then the second question will be, how's your team's productivity and performance now versus pre-COVID? So let me just go there. I'll just open up the poll. So while that's opening up, the main things I hope to focus on in this session is to provide a framework for you to think about what high-performing teams require, what are the ingredients that make up a high-performing team. And given the questions and where I think people are having the most challenges, I want to focus on the culture and individual performance side versus focusing on the structures and processes. So the poll should now be open. If you guys want to answer for yourself, how is your own productivity and performance now versus pre-COVID? Are you guys able to see the screen?
Yeah, I can. And also I voted as well, so yeah, it should be good.
I'm not sure how many people have voted. Let's just give folks, 7 people have voted. I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to log in and vote. So we've got 11 votes at the moment. As you're watching these numbers, I'm curious whether this is lining up to your expectations. So it looks like, in general, people are feeling they're more productive now than they were pre-COVID. And that's probably not surprising for some, and I can understand why some people are slightly lower, and I can also now start to understand why some people are slightly higher. You know, when we first went into COVID, I would have expected the results to skew more to the right, but it feels like people are finding their groove, and now the results are skewing to the left. Let's have a look at the next slide. And how's your team's performance now versus pre-COVID? That's interesting. So it feels like most people are finding that their teams are operating pretty well. So I'd love to hear from a couple of folks. So what do you think has happened that allows your team to be more productive than they were pre-COVID? Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. No commute?
Well,
Yep.
Yeah, I guess for myself, it's no commuting and less distractions. Would be the two things. I think the other thing here, I think it feels that I'm slightly more productive, but I don't know if I'm more satisfied. Is in that sense, like I feel like I can get more work done, but there's something missing. It's not as fulfilling as before.
Yeah. That's right. I agree with Tim, who also said people with kids are probably less productive because they've got more things to manage, whereas people without kids might be finding that they've got more space for work. Yeah, and I've got 3 kids, so I understand and feel the pain of the parents here and the people who have caring responsibilities. So let me flip over back to my presentation and we can have a look at some of the other reasons why performance might be different now compared to before. So we've talked a little bit about the individual challenges. A lot of people have blurred lines now between work and home. As Joel said, you might not be more satisfied because you're potentially working more or working in a different way. There's a loneliness, isolation, and I think a lot of people might underestimate the impact of the loss of routine. So before you might be getting exercise and going to the gym every morning before you head into work, and now that gyms are closed or you're not heading into work, that loss of routine really does change your ability to be at your best. There's also challenges around team effectiveness and efficiency. I'm guessing at the beginning, people had a really steep learning curve trying to figure out new ways of working together, how to navigate what happens when someone's not in the room and I need to answer quickly. Do I text them? Do I call them? What's the right thing to do? There's also more asynchronous work because people aren't all sitting in the office at the same time. And there are also technical challenges or missing or not standardized tools. So sometimes one team might be using Meet for their meetings, another team might be using Zoom. And how do you navigate between using those different tools? And finally, I think this is a piece that a lot of people are interested in, the culture and team identity. So it's really hard to have a common identity when you're not all together, when you have fewer of those bonding experiences, those water cooler moments. And what that means sometimes is a loss of spontaneity and creativity and a sense of just being part of a bigger whole. Have people experienced any of this or have any other challenges that they've seen?
One anti-challenge is, I mean, it's hard to take care of kids. I have 2, so it's hard, but it's also, I have never spent so much time with my kids before. And after COVID, I don't think it's going to happen. So I love that. I mean, I know life is hard, blah, whatever, but it's not a war. It feels like a war, but the good thing is it's not a war. And we get to spend so much time with them. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is. I say it's it's the high highs and low lows when it's home with kids and trying to work. Are there any other pieces around culture and identity that you guys are finding challenging? I've heard a little bit about, getting a pulse on the mental health and the well-being of your team. Are there other pieces that you guys are seeing?
Yeah, I was going to say new hires. I think it's really, really challenging to come into a company as somebody new, full stop. Never mind during the current situation where it's really hard to get a sense of the culture, because so much of the culture is in meeting people and in seeing the way that people collaborate, or going around the office and, like you say, the water cooler conversations. So all of that just gets taken away. So I do think it's very, very challenging for new hires at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think it's when you have your collective team meetups. So in my company, we adopted our version of TGIF, and it's not a mandatory thing. So sometimes it's very disheartening when it's the same people that keep attending the virtual TGIFs, but the others don't, and I feel like it's creating a divide within my company inadvertently. And I don't feel comfortable mandating them to attend. So that's one of my challenges, those cultural things that aren't sustained because there's no physical presence.
Yeah. I think inclusion is a really important thing to consider, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the culture. It's a great point. And we'll have some tips later on how you might be able to overcome that. Fabulous. So let me move on to the next slide. So at the beginning stages of COVID, I think you guys will be familiar with some of these feelings and what had to happen when we first moved to remote work. There was a shock of having this big change thrust upon us and total inexperience for a lot of people in working from home. So what was required from leaders and from organizations was to quickly set up the tools needed to keep the workplace running and to ensure the physical safety of folks. And as people settled in and they've got their equipment ready and they're able to work from home, you start facing challenges like, oh, how do we share files across our team? How do we resolve a particular conflict? And those challenges a lot of times are resolved on the go. So you just band-aid a solution because that's what works and that's what we need to have a quick fix. And from a people perspective, what team leaders and HR professionals would be doing are supporting the team through the emotional roller coaster. There's a frustration, there's a doubt. There's so many different challenges people are facing, from the anxiety of potentially losing their job to not knowing whether their health is whether they're going to stay healthy and whether their people in their family are going to stay healthy, through to managing all these new responsibilities like homeschooling or dealing with the loneliness. So in those early stages, it was very much, let's just attack the problem. Let's just try and band-aid and keep on top of things, as opposed to try and think about what's a more sustainable and long-term way of dealing with this. And the phase that we're starting to head into, and likely why you see a lot of people saying that the teams are starting to be more productive now than pre-COVID, is that people are shifting to a sense of acceptance, knowing that we're not going to be rushing back to work anytime soon. Life in the office will never be the same again. And needing to not just firefight and do the business as usual things, but also think about the longer term sustainability of the business. You know, what projects and priorities do we need to be focused on now to keep the business afloat beyond the next 3 months, but a lot longer. And then as a team leader and as an organization, there's a need to then help people manage their mental health and also adapt to new norms. And I'd say that for most teams and organizations, if you're not really deliberate about it, this is where it stops. People come to this sense of acceptance. They will continue to do things with the workarounds that they've developed over the last few months, and they'll potentially be working quite inefficiently and ineffectively. So what's required now is to reimagine and reform the way we work. And I think what I'm suggesting to everyone on the call is that it's really a worthwhile exercise to take a step back before some of these habits and these new ways of working get embedded, and make sure that the way that you are working and the way that individuals are set up and the way that the culture is being curated is what you want for the future. And what that means is, how do we design our operating model in such a way that the structures and processes serve us? And then also in the longer term, how do we create a safe and inclusive space for people to do their best work? Before I move on, I'll just take a pause there. Are there any thoughts, comments, reflections from this? Okay. I hope that this feels familiar, and you would have seen the journey at the top, similar to what you experience if you're doing a large-scale transformation or change. This is what happens when people go through change. There's a shock, and then over time, as they accept the reality of what's the new normal is, hopefully it'll turn into hope and new beginnings.
Yes, also Grace, just kind of looking at that transition in terms of the team perspective, it's also what business is doing. So they had the initial reaction of, you know, trying to deal with the here and now and trying to keep up with all the regulation changes. But now the companies that are really progressing, excuse me, are actually looking to look what gaps or what shifts are being made in the consumer markets or in their general competitor market, and trying to get ahead of the curve with that and trying to capitalize and create a new way of operating. So this is kind of reflective in the business side as well.
Absolutely. This is a really nice segue to the 4 ingredients that I've outlined here as needed for high-performing remote teams. And I could argue that you actually need all these 4 ingredients for regular teams, but just the way you might think about it is a little bit different for remote teams. So I'm going to focus less in detail when I talk through the slides on the top 2, because this is more the what. So what's the organization doing? How do we create a purpose and priorities? What are the tools and structures that we need? And I'll spend most of the time talking about the how. So this is the culture, about how do we ensure that each individual is working at their best. And I'm not sure who spoke. Elena, who just spoke, has made a really clear point about purpose. So organizations as a whole could be shifting the focus of their work and could be potentially realigning what the purpose of different teams are. So it's a really important time, if that's the case in your industry or in your organization, to make sure the team is still clear on what their purpose is. And for some organizations and for some teams, these purpose hasn't changed, and the priorities and goals also haven't changed. But it's also a really good time, regardless, to make sure that the team is clear and to re-communicate that. At a time like this, when there's just so much going on, it's really easy for people to lose sight of the bigger picture. And this is where, as a team leader, there's an opportunity to just revisit some of the team's purpose and goals and priorities and just make sure that everyone is clear. And what's particularly important in distributed work is to make sure that people can see what they're doing and how it contributes to the bigger picture. Because sometimes it's easy to just put your head down and be told what to do and just get on with the work. But in the environment where context really matters, what you really want to do is make sure the team and the individuals in the team are also clear on why they're doing what they're doing. And I think someone in the questions in the Google form said, how do we empower people in remote work? I think one of the ways that you can empower people is to make sure that they can have a clear line of sight to how they're contributing to a bigger goal, and also just creating the opportunities for them to define what the solution is as opposed to dictating it. I think so for some teams, purpose, priorities, and goals are going to be really important to revisit. And for some other teams, it's just a case of reminding individuals. But for all teams, I think team norms really need to be front and center and discussed as a whole. And when I talk about team norms, what are the things I'm talking about? So it could be, how do we make decisions? How do we communicate our feedback and resolve conflicts? It's a lot easier when you're in person to step over to someone's desk and ask them a quick question. But in this way, in distributed way of working, are you involving the right people in making the decisions, because someone can't just hear the conversation going on because they're sitting in the same room? And are there norms around the boundaries that you have around personal life and professional life? So before, everyone might have been sitting in the office and when they're there, they're present. But maybe now, between the hours of 10 to 12 in the morning, a colleague might be helping their child with a Zoom lesson. How do you ensure that you're clear that this is happening and not, and the team being mindful of what's happening and then operating around that? So the way to set up some team norms are to get your team together and make sure that everyone's part of the conversation. And one way you can think about it now is to say, hey, what's working well from our transition to remote work, and what's not working? And it's not just a matter of then discussing just the things that are not working, but also clearly documenting the things that are working and just establishing them as things that this is how the team works and this is how we do things.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Please do not laugh, because I am in an emerging market. I work in the Philippines. So we've put kind of a lot of things in place to help. We have an all-day call that people can dial into. You just mute it, and anytime you have a question, you just unmute it because everybody's on there. So it kind of duplicates walking over to somebody's desk for a 2-minute chat. Not everybody joins that for different reasons, but I don't know if anybody else experiences this. I get a lot of concerns on bandwidth and internet connections because the Philippines does not have the best Wi-Fi at all. So I don't know if anybody has the same issues and what your stopgaps are for that. On one hand, we had a portable modem that we would ship to whoever it was having bad connectivity, and then they'd use that until their internet was back up. I don't know if that's a sustainable solution. Do you think we should pivot and just provide modems for all of our employees? Again, that's a cost issue, but I'd appreciate any ideas anybody has.
I'll open it up to the gallery before I chime in with my thoughts. Well, I think I think the problem you're trying to solve is how do we create some of these water cooler moments and the ability for people to talk to each other in a quick manner. Like, you can consider some other synchronous type options, like a chat of some sort. So could you start a Slack channel where people can type their questions and people are monitoring and have the messages pop up as they come in? Instead of having a video option, could you consider just a phone hookup where people just sit their phone dialed into a particular number? That's just a couple of different ideas that I have. Do you think they could be workable in your situation?
So we do currently. We do have Slack abound on Slack. But again, that seems to be an issue for a lot of them. They drop off because their internet just cuts out. And in the Philippines, for some reason, when they update your connection, sometimes you could be down for 5 days. So I don't know if anybody else has that issue.
I think if it's a fundamental infrastructure issue where your employees can't do their work because of infrastructure, like it's like layer 1 infrastructure, then I would probably take the cost and ship them more modems to kind of standardize on an infrastructure layer, and that everyone's got connectivity, especially when you think about this is going to be the way to work for the foreseeable future. And then, go from there, because it seems to be an underlying infrastructure problem, and those foundational things you need to have in place for teams to be effective. So I think it's worth the cost to the business in that respect. That's my personal opinion.
Agreed, Joel. And I think another thing to lean into in this is to involve your team in finding the solution. So yes, connectivity is an issue. Are there creative ways that the team can come up with that they can work around this somehow? Like, the decision and the problem solving doesn't have to rest with you as the leader or with the broader leadership team. I think this is a good time to engage in some sort of bottom-up innovation to see what's possible.
Grace, maybe I'll throw a question back at you on the same topic. Can you share more about how you and your immediate team at perhaps larger McKinsey has addressed the same question? Are there advice that come top down, bottoms up? How small is the team that makes these type of decisions? The first person that joined the call has a team of over 40. Sometimes the team norms for teams of 40 is unrealistic. Maybe it's a smaller team. Can you share some advice, please, on these things?
Yeah, I think the team norms need to be a bit smaller. It's like your working group, and then you might want to have team norms across a group, so multiple teams. And sorry, Chris, can you just repeat the earlier parts of your question again?
McKinsey itself, as well as your own immediate team.
Yeah, so we use Slack quite a lot for communications. We also use Box, and so we use Box Notes to trade answers and to make sure that everyone's on the same page they need to be. So people don't need to be on all the time, but they can also go back and see what's been happening in the discussions that have gone on, and they can chime in at a time that suits them. In terms of like creating those water cooler type moments, what we've done is create what we call neighborhood gangs. So they're groups of 5 or 6 people who live in close proximity with each other. And these groups gather once a week and have short conversations just to check in on how everyone's going, talk about stuff that's going on in the organization, say reflect on a question that's been asked on our regular surveys, because we're getting pulse surveys every week. And then those groups, because we don't have as tight restrictions right now of meeting, they might get together physically every now and again. And that's why the groups were created based on proximity and how close people live with each other. There's just some examples.
How did you get those gangs organized? Were they self-organized, or like
No.
from a privacy standpoint, how did you, get all the addresses of the employees and clustered them?
So it was organized by our HR area. So they have all the addresses already. So they literally just, plotted everyone on a map and found people who lived close to each other. And I think most people don't mind joining a call for 15, 20, 30 minutes a week just to check in. And again, it's one of those things that's optional. You don't have to show up. But I think people who have formed gangs that are close continue to meet beyond the 30 minutes, and they go out and they see each other, and they've created more of a community with their families just beyond the workplace. And what's really great about the neighborhood gangs is it's not just people that you work with in your team, it's across our whole office. We've got about 500 people, and we've got everyone in gangs of 6 to 8, which means that assistants could be in the same group as a designer who's in the same group as the senior partner. And that also just creates new social networks that wouldn't be existent otherwise.
Great, thanks.
So let me move on to the structures, processes, and tools. So we've talked a little bit about this. And when I talk about structures, processes, and tools, it's things like you might actually need to reconfigure your teams and think about how you form sub-teams within your team based on needing to do remote work. And reporting structures might also need to change. So this is a good time to revisit those. It's really important to make sure the cadence of communications and meetings is clear for people. In particular, one-on-one meetings is really important. I would encourage all team leaders to be meeting at least once a week with their direct reports, just to check in on how they're going, to continue development conversations, and to just get to know what's going on for them, so that you can catch any potential issues early, but also just capture feedback and areas of improvement. And then we've talked a little bit about the communication and collaboration tools. It's really important to just think through what's needed and how you're using different channels. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see some of the design principles. We've talked a bit about things like involving the team and making sure their needs are met, and creating accessible single source of truth and documenting it so that people can always come back to it, because it's harder to ask the quick questions, and just to cater for different types of interactions. So people are going to be synchronous, asynchronous. Sometimes parts of teams might be able to meet up, while other times everyone's going to be virtual. And I think one of the most important things when you're designing these structures, processes, and tools is to regularly assess whether they're working and then adapt them. So don't hang on to something just because we've decided today that we want it. If it's not working for you 2 months down the track, just pivot, because there's just a great need for us to be adaptable and flexible. And that's why you actually want to build for flexibility from the beginning. Any thoughts or comments on this one before I move on? Okay, so let's move to some of the more juicy things, or what I find the juicy pieces around how we create high-performing teams. Now, I've got here having team members at their best, and then more broadly, creating a caring and inclusive culture. I mean, we've all heard the cliche that we're only as strong as our weakest link, and high-performing teams need to be made up of high-performing individuals. And that includes you. And this model that I'm going to share with you is a way to think about how you yourself can be operating at your best. And it's a model that you can share with others in your team and ask them to also think about their personal operating model and what they need to bring. And when I say personal operating model, what I mean is, you know, what are we focused on? What are we getting done? How do we run our lives? And there are 4 elements. So the first element is understanding what roles you play in your life. So you might be a leader, you might be a team member, you could be a parent, you could be a community leader somehow. So in those roles, do you know what's expected of you? Both what you expect of yourself and what others expect of you. And then how are you showing up? So sometimes there can be conflict. So if you are, say, in the middle of the workday trying to take a really important call, but your child bursts in the door and wants your attention, there are different ways to deal with that interruption. So are you showing up with your child and with your colleagues in the way that you want to? Or how do you want to show up? That's some questions you want to ask around your role. The second is, what are your priorities? So Joel, you talked earlier about, you know, I'm more productive, but it feels a little bit less meaningful. So are you focusing on the things that bring you meaning? And, you know, given that we're now working remotely, have your priorities shifted in some way? You know, before you might not have had to talk to your team one-on-one every week because you were seeing each other all the time, you had the casual conversation. But now your priority, if you want to really find out how your teammate's going, is to schedule time in the calendar every week. So around priorities is like, what behaviors, habits, and practices can help me better focus on my priorities? And underpinning the roles and priorities is, how do we use our time? Are you spending time the way you want to or that you need to? And more importantly, in the time that you've allocated to an activity, are you actually present and engaged? So are you perhaps going out for a walk in the afternoon to try and clear your head, but actually spending all that time thinking about the next meeting that you have to do? How can you switch off and use the time in the way that you set it aside for? And the other big question is, are you finding time for deep work and reflection? There's a danger in these when we're working remotely and there's always Slack messages coming in or WhatsApp messages coming in and emails, that you're constantly interrupted. So are you creating spaces in your calendar to do the deep work and to do the deep thinking? And are you taking time to reflect and take a step back from everything so you can see your operating model as a whole and you can see how your team is operating as a whole? And then finally, energy. You could argue that energy underpins everything, because if you have no energy and you have time and your priorities and roles, you still can't get anything done. So how aware are you of what gives you energy and what drains your energy? And what are you doing to proactively renew the different sources of energy? Because energy is not just one dimension. There's physical energy, there's emotional energy, there's social energy or spiritual energy. So how do you relate to the bigger picture in life? And there's mental energy. And there are things that you can do, activities you can do to define each part of your operating model. And as you can see by the circle, they all relate to each other. And I've just started to pose some of the questions that you can start thinking about as you're creating your operating model. But I thought what I can do is just dive into energy and give you a chance to experience what it's like to think about, to start designing your operating model. Would that be helpful? Yes, cool. Okay, so yeah, the wonderful thing about energy, unlike time, which is finite, we can renew it. You know, even if you're low on energy, you don't need to have a big sleep every night, although it's very helpful. There are some smaller things that you can do every day to recover your energy and to create a sense of renewal. So I just want to take you on a bit of an activity. You might want to shut your eyes or, you know, find a way where you can just turn inwards a little bit, maybe look out the window and just reflect back to last Monday and play in your mind the week that you had. So what were the big milestones that you had? What were the ordinary day-to-day activities that you did? How did you spend your weekend? And just get a feel for what your week was like last week. Now, pick 1 or 2 times when you felt really drained during the week. Like, what were you doing physically? And how were you using your body? What part of the brain were you using? What were you thinking about? And who were the people that you were with? And what kind of emotions were you feeling when you were with them or when you were feeling drained? And how did the draining activity relate to your values or what you love about life or what you care about in life? Now, shake off that draining feeling and reflect back on your week again and think of the times when you felt really energized and really, really happy, excited, full of life. What were you doing? Who were you with? What were you thinking and feeling when you were doing those things? You might want to jot down your reflections on a piece of paper. I've got a slide up which can help you organize your thoughts if you want to organize your thoughts that way. But this is just a short activity to start helping you see whether there are patterns in what drains you and what boosts you. So for example, some people might feel really drained by doing administrative tasks. And you know, they have to be done sometimes, but how can you potentially look at administrative tasks and maybe bookend it with a more exciting activity or something that brings your energy back after you're done? Or potentially you do an energizing activity so you go in and don't feel drained already by facing that administrative tasks. And the other thing you might notice is that the drainers or the boosters don't have to be really big things. So you could have gotten a boost by walking past a bunch of flowers that you've left on your table. Or you could be boosted by just sending a quick text or receiving a quick text from your friend with a happy smiling photo. So these are the things that you can start planning deliberately and placing into your days and shaping your day so that you have a mix of, if you've had a downer of an activity, to go into to think about what will help you boost your energy ready for the next task. And I'll leave you with the 2 questions on the right-hand side. So what are you noticing? What's draining your energy and what's boosting your energy? And then what can you do differently to achieve your energy balance, knowing that you can never be super happy and positive and energized, but also knowing that being tired and drained and unhappy is not a permanent state. I'm curious, does anyone have any reflections, any ahas based on that exercise?
I think it's great to remember that the boosters can be really, really small things. I think we often focus on these being the things that like drive us. And, you know, when you talk about bookending, if we're thinking about something that's really big, it can be difficult to work into the day. But when you suddenly realize it can be really, really small things, I think that was the realization for me. It doesn't have to be big things every time.
In a way also, Grace, you appreciate the small things so much more now that you're almost in isolation, that you're within a confined environment, so to speak, you know, with the various lockdowns, moving more harsh and then less harsh. And it does really make you stop and look at the everyday things and gain a much deeper sense of appreciation for them and also beauty.
Yes. And when we think about scaling this beyond just yourself, so you've had some realizations doing this short activity, this is a really easy exercise to just do with your team. Even if you build it into as a 10-minute exercise at the beginning of your next team meeting, it doesn't have to be a long drawn out exercise. You can just help people see that there are things that they can do to help themselves and manage their energy or manage their time. And there are different activities you can do across all these different dimensions, but I think what's really helpful is to first start with yourself and think about how do you be at your best and what do you need, and not to think it's selfish to, you know, to take care of yourself and go out for a walk, and to not be and to be really mindful, for example, not to be too distracted. So yes, it's great to maybe watch a webcast that you've missed from work while you're taking a walk, but is that really helping you recharge and refresh? And is that the best use of your time? And these are some of the things that you can share with your team. And when we talk about leading by example and being a role model, these are the things you can start communicating to your team, which then can open up avenues for them to have discussions about these things and to share ideas and to know that it's okay to look after yourself and invest in self-care. So I've just got here some ideas that you can quickly do to renew your energy. So you can learn something new, you can watch a TED Talk for your mental levers, physically just get up every hour. Something as simple as taking a deep breath can be really renewing. The other one is having a meal that really helps just boost the energy and levels by increasing the oxygen that's in your body. So on the emotional levers, you know, watch a movie, watch a cute cat video, call a friend. None of these take a lot of time. And spirit, I think, Lisa, you were talking about beauty. So it takes a moment to appreciate something beautiful that's in your environment, and it's there, it's everywhere.
So I wanted to share something that I discovered with my team, and it was kind of connected to a comment earlier that sometimes you feel more productive because you don't waste time in traffic. But what I discovered is travel time actually is like a cognitive cleanse. You kind of reset when you have to commute to and from a meeting, and that goes away, and you can have a cut-to-cut kind of day where you have several meetings and not a single break, not even time to go to the toilet. So what we've decided to do to cognitively cleanse people is 30 minutes before and after every client meeting, we actually put a buffer for travel time. So this actually helps people reset if you need to, I don't know, freshen up, just kind of stop what it is that you're doing, prep for the meeting. And no meetings are allowed to be set during this proverbial travel time. And it seems to do a lot for their, you know, their energy renewal, both before and after. And this is just for external meetings, because naturally, if you were having an internal meeting, you would need to commute to and from the meeting room, but it seems to help them a lot.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think sometimes if you can't carve out the 30 minutes before and after, you can always cut meetings short. So instead of setting up 30 and 60-minute meetings, make them 25 and 50-minute meetings. I think research has shown that meetings take as long as you give them, like the decisions are made in the last 5 to 10 minutes of meetings. So whether it's a 30-minute meeting or a 25-minute meeting, you're likely to get to a clear outcome by the end, even if you have 5 minutes less. And just another great point that you raised about the space and the buffer. We talk about there being a third space that's possible. So the first space being where you've come from, and the second space being where you're heading into. But in the middle, there's a space in between, which is called the third space. And for some people, the commute to work is that third space between home and work. So one suggestion is, how can you create third spaces in your life that don't have to be 30 minutes long or have to be traveling from one place to another? So could you, for example, make sure that you get up and go for a walk around your living room between each call, and consider that to be your third space? Another thing that's quite quick to do, which I love to do myself and I love to share with other people, is to just take a moment at the end of a meeting or end of an interaction, when some activity ends, to just sit down and just jot down a few reflections from that activity. So either, what did I take away from it? What am I grateful for from that experience? What do I need to do? And just have it all there, have it laid out on a piece of paper so you can see it. And then think forward to the next interaction or the next activity that you're moving into. What would you like to get out of that activity? What's your intent walking into that meeting or walking into that interaction? What do you need coming out of that interaction? And just either make a mental note of that or write that down on paper. And then come to your third space and just take a moment to center yourself. So it could be taking a deep breath, could be drinking a cup of tea, could be just feeling your feet on the ground. That activity in itself, where you've parked what's happened in the past, you have a clear intent on what you want in the future, and then coming back to the present is also a really, really nice way to reset. And it only can take as little as a minute. It doesn't take any more time than that. Of course, you can stretch it out, but one of the biggest challenges I think people are facing in remote work is this context switching, the constant context switching. And this little stop between two activities can just help you context switch and give focus to the next activity that you're doing, so you are fully present when you do it. So let me move away from the individual. I know there are probably a lot more questions around that, but I just want to cover in the last few minutes around the culture. So there are 5 things here listed on how you can create a more caring and inclusive culture for your remote team. The first is really probably the most paramount, and Google was one of the leading researchers around psychological safety, figuring out that it's one of the most important things that teams need, and we need it more than ever in this time when there are heightened anxieties from lots of different places, and when people don't have body language and the ability to read the situation as clearly. So how do you cultivate trust and build psychological safety? And I'll talk a little bit more about that if we've got time. So the second is to lead with vulnerability, curiosity, and empathy. This is where it's really helpful as a leader or a team member to share what's going on for you and to be vulnerable about your experience. So if you are having a really rough day and you need to manage the kids while something is going on, let your team know. And be curious about what's going on for other people and their experiences. Because there's just so much going on that we can't partition out anymore, that we need to just be a little bit more open. We need to be more compassionate with each other. Third is being aware of and acknowledging other people's experiences. Just like you might have different situations that you're facing in your team, in your own life, other people are likely facing their own challenges. You know, someone who has kids, I acknowledge that there are other colleagues of mine who don't have families, but maybe feeling really lonely because they're living on their own. So how can we help and support each other through the different contexts that each of us have? To the next point, build space for diverse perspectives and encourage greater participation. Someone mentioned earlier, you know, the TGIFs, it's usually the same people that come to that, and you don't want to mandate it. So are there different ways that you can encourage people to participate? Is it a case of not making it drinks every Friday, but actually including some sort of activity and rotating the responsibility for who organizes the activity? So one person might want a games night, but another person has a cocktail event, or someone else wants to do a book club. So how can you create a sense of ownership and the ability for people to bring their unique interests and their unique needs to the group? And on a work front, you know, what are ways that you can create greater participation? Is it making sure that people get the agenda early and are clear on what the questions are and have a chance to think about it, so when you jump on, the introverts are able to respond because they've already given it some thought? Is it making sure that only the most important people that need to be on the call are on the call, so it's not crowded out by people that don't need to be there? And just thinking really thoughtfully about how you bring in diverse perspectives. And then finally, make time for structured remote team building and to engage individually. We've talked a little bit about this. And I think the team building events doesn't have to be these special once a week or, you know, anything that's big. It can happen in the first 5 minutes of a meeting. Like I said, you can say, hey, you know, let's just go around the room and say, what's the best thing that's happened for us today? And give a chance for everybody to speak. And on the second point, to engage individually, it really is very important, I think, for individual team leaders to have conversations with their teammates or to the direct reports, so they have a sense of what's going on. And it's not about probing into their lives, but just creating time for organic conversations. And for me personally, with my teams, I just set up times that I call social chats. Like, we're not going to talk about work, we're just going to catch up and see what's going on in each other's day. And this is my way of trying to bypass or to recreate the water cooler moment, but in a more structured way. And earlier someone said, oh, how do I get a sense of what the organization or what my broader team is feeling? One thing that we are doing at McKinsey is that every week there's a pulse survey that goes out with different questions. So I think the question went out this week saying, you know, how are you feeling about your McKinsey experience this week? Other times is, if we were to, or how excited are you about returning back to the office? And this just gives you a sense. It's all voluntary, no one has to do it, but it aggregates the results up, and then you can just get a sense of the sentiment of the organization and of teams. And it just gives leaders something to work with. And if it's awkward to talk about without this prompt, you can say, hey, I just saw the results for our team or for our broader division, and it feels like most people are feeling quite anxious this week. That's just an opening for a conversation to happen. I know I'm very short of time. I am able to stay for a bit longer. I know Chris is not. So I'm happy to open it up to questions for anyone who wants to stay or has questions. I'm also happy to share these slides with you and some of the other slides I prepared that I haven't shared today.
And maybe Grace, there's 2 more slides in the main section. Perhaps you can just give an overview of the 2 more that people know what to expect.
Yeah, so in this main section, this is one thing you can do to look at trust in your team. So when someone says trust, there are actually a few dimensions of trust. And if you start mapping it out based on how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the team, it's also a great conversation starter. I think another really interesting thing to do is to rate your trust with your family and with your friends. And I've done this activity lots of times with folks. You see that the reliability is often quite low with your friends, but quite high with your work. So that's just an interesting food for thought. And then here are some questions you can reflect on after you've done your trust exercise. And here at the end, I've got some questions that people brought, but we don't have time to answer them. I'm happy to answer them if you email me. You've got my email address on the right. And if anyone is interested in exploring more about their personal operating model, I'm happy to run some small groups with people on this call to take you through each of the elements of the operating model in more detail and to work through how you can create an operating model that helps you be at your best.
Thank you so much, Grace. I'm going to stop the recording now.